It's a document that could mean major changes to the Yukon's mining industry. First Nations and the Yukon government are negotiating a framework for a new mining law. But the process and the framework had been kept largely secret. The CBC obtained a copy of the draft framework through an access to information request. The CBC's Chris Windeyer has been following the story, and he joins me now with more. So, Chris, what's in this document?
Well, Megan, this framework outlines what would be some sweeping changes to the Yukon's mining laws. It brings First Nations into the mining regime in a much more structured way. There's language that says First Nations can ask the Yukon government to close off certain parcels of land to exploration. The Yukon government doesn't have to say yes, but there is at least now a process for those requests. There's also the potential for new policies governing remediation and cleanup, and for new enforcement powers and penalties against projects that break the rules. But perhaps the biggest proposed change has to do with the way mineral rights are granted. Under the current system, prospector claims automatically include mineral rights. Under the proposed new system, prospectors would apply for what's called an area of mineral exclusivity. That basically means the right to explore that land for minerals. They would then have to apply for mineral rights after working the claim. It is important to note that this does not mean that you can just go ahead and open a mine. All the environmental assessment and water license protocols would still apply. But this change would be significant because it's effectively an end to the free entry staking system as it's currently practiced. That system grants mineral rights automatically to prospectors working public lands.
Okay, so instead of someone being able to stake a claim and have rights to that land, there are more steps now before that can happen. What's been the response then to this framework, Chris?
Well, the reviews on this are decidedly mixed. This process is extremely important to First Nations governments here. There's a lot riding on this, both for them and for the mining industry. But not all First Nations are happy with the draft. I spoke with Donna Hope. She's the chief of the First Nation of Natchanayak in central Yukon. And their traditional territory is home to the Eagle gold mine disaster. That's where a heap leach pile failed and released millions of tons of cyanide solution into the environment. Hope says this framework doesn't go nearly far enough.
To make it acceptable to the First Nation of Natchanayak, it needs to respect core principles and promises in the final agreement. And that includes the right to co-manage our lands and resources with public government in partnership, and the right to sustainable development defined within the final agreement as beneficial socioeconomic change that does not undermine the ecological and social systems upon which communities and societies are dependent upon.
And I'll just add too that Hope says, at least for now, Natchanayak plans to enforce its own mining policy, though the Yukon government says its laws still apply.
What about the mining industry here, Chris? What is that saying?
Well, broadly speaking, industry is not against a new mining law, but they are always worried about certainty. They want a clear regime with clear rules and timelines. But the Yukon Chamber of Mines still hasn't seen the whole draft yet. Chamber President Jonas Smith says the mining industry should have been involved from the get-go.
My understanding is both the public and First Nation governments look forward to industry's input. I would just argue that when they're talking about entirely redoing how things are done, not only in the Yukon, but industry-wide around the world, that industry should be informing those discussions before expectations are set and potentially have to be walked back to something that is, if not more realistic, at the very least needs to consider the competitiveness of our jurisdiction.
So we mentioned at the top of this conversation, Chris, that you got this document through an access to information request. Why did we have to do that to get this document? Is it normal to have access to this, or is this something different?
Well, just rewind a few weeks here. We had both Hope and Smith on our local Yukon morning radio show talking about this process, and both of them expressed frustration at the time that they couldn't speak more freely with their respective memberships about the framework. Now, it is pretty unusual that the public gets a look at a document like this that is still under negotiation. Under the Yukon's access to information rules, the government may refuse to release information that could harm relations between the Yukon government and another government. So what remains unclear here is whether this document was released to the CBC on purpose or by mistake. But we are reporting on it because this is a major potential change to an important law, and it's in the public's interest for people to know about it.
Absolutely. I'm sure there's a ton of public interest in this. What happens next in all of this, Chris?
Well, most likely the election. The territorial election has to happen by November 3rd, and that means there's no time for another legislative session before voters go to the polls here. And even if there was, there's just no way that a new mining bill could be drafted, debated, and passed in time. So quite simply, we are a long way from seeing any new actual mining legislation. And while the governing Yukon Liberals have been driving this process since they've been in power, it is possible that they might not be in power after the election. So let's give the last word here to Mathia Alatini. She's the Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations. She says the hope is to get this framework to a place that it will go ahead no matter who's in power.
It would be problematic if any future government came in and did not actually adhere to the wishes of 5 years worth of work from all representatives of these voices. I think it would be foolish to have that work thrown away. And it will be the work of this next government, whomever it is, to put pen to paper and sit down at the table and develop that legislation based on this framework.
So one other thing to note here, Megan, is that this current process started in 2021, but the requirement for new mining laws actually goes back even further than that, to 2001. That's when the Yukon government signed a devolution agreement with Ottawa. So really, this whole thing is 25 years in the making. And the Grand Chief is making it clear that she expects whoever forms the next Yukon government to follow through on this.
Okay, thanks for all your work on this, Chris.
You're welcome.